In a village tucked away behind steep hills and thick forests, where outsiders were rare and questions even rarer, lived a girl named Lena. She was known by many as the girl who hardly spoke, the one who wandered alone, who stared too long at the sky, and who often seemed lost in a world far beyond the narrow dirt roads and colorless stone walls of their settlement. She was not like the other children, who obeyed quietly, memorized the official chants, and repeated the council's words like prayers. Lena questioned things, silently, in her mind, where no one could see or punish her for it. Her eyes held a brightness that unsettled some, a quiet kind of defiance that dared not show itself in voice or action, but in the stillness of her gaze and the sharpness of her mind. The village was ruled by the Council of Elders, a group of stern, cloaked men who wore the same long robes each day and spoke with the same heavy voice of unquestionable authority. Their word was law. Their stories were the only stories. Every citizen was taught from birth that truth lived in the council's scrolls and that nothing else mattered. Books, those dangerous vessels of thought and imagination, were forbidden. It was said that long ago, when books were still allowed, chaos had erupted, people had turned on each other, and madness had spread like disease. To protect the village, the elders had burned every book, every record of the old days, and written new truths. These truths were carved into the great stone tablets placed at the village center. No one dared challenge what was etched in stone. But Lena knew something they didn't. Beneath the creaking beams of their narrow house, hidden behind loose floorboards and dusty trunks in the attic, her mother kept a secret. A collection of old, faded books, rescued from the flames years ago and passed down from a sister who had vanished under mysterious circumstances. Lena's mother had once been a promising healer, chosen by the elders themselves, but something had shifted in her years ago, something had broken. She had become quiet, cautious, and yet determined. She taught Lena to read in whispers, only at night, only by the flicker of a single candle, and always with the warning, never speak of this, not to anyone, not even in dreams. As the seasons passed, Lena grew into the words like roots growing around stone, slowly, steadily, powerfully. She read about faraway lands with golden towers and creatures that breathed fire. She read about love that defied kings and women who defied gods. She read about revolutions sparked by a single idea, a single word. The words opened something inside her, something that ached and burned. And when reading wasn't enough, she began to write. At first, her stories were simple, little tales of a girl and her dog, or of birds that carried messages across the sea. But soon, they took on deeper shapes. She began to notice things around her, the sadness in the baker's eyes when he looked at the council hall, the bruises on the gardener's arms he never explained, the way children were taken away for correction and returned quiet and trembling. These hidden truths became seeds for her stories. She gave them fictional names and fantasy settings, but their meanings were clear to anyone who dared look closely. She wrote on scraps of cloth, on old sacks, on the backs of smuggled leaflets. She stored her stories in a hollow brick behind the fireplace, where even mice wouldn't go. Her mother, though fearful, couldn't help but smile at her daughter's gift. "Just be careful," she would say, every night, as if a prayer. But one day, the careful world Lena had built crumbled with the simplest accident. It was a quiet morning. The air smelled of burnt bread and wet soil. A boy no older than 7 had found a scrap of cloth blowing in the alley near the market square. On it, written in neat ink, was one of Lena's tales, a story about a foolish group of men who locked the village in fear, convincing them that books were poison and dreams were dangerous. In the story, a small bird taught the children to sing a forgotten song, and the villagers began to remember. Laughter returned. Music returned. And the old men, afraid of losing their grip, tried to silence the bird. But the song had already taken root. The boy, innocent and unaware of danger, read the story aloud to a group of merchants and their children as they rested beneath the shade of the market tree. His voice was high and cheerful. He stumbled over some words but smiled through them. Laughter followed. One woman wiped a tear from her cheek. Another covered her mouth to muffle a gasp. But among the crowd stood a man dressed in gray, an informant of the council. Within hours, the market emptied. The boy was taken in for questioning. The merchants were warned. The tree under which he had read was roped off, as if diseased. And the council held an emergency meeting that very night. They had heard of whispers before, fragments of dangerous stories passed between hands in the shadows. But this was public. This was defiance. The story, though masked as fiction, was clearly mocking their authority. It described them too well, the old men who fed on fear, the book burners in gold-threaded robes. The council was furious. An official decree was issued the next day. A full investigation into the origin of the treasonous tale would begin immediately. Every household would be searched. Children would be questioned. Writing tools would be confiscated. Anyone found in possession of unauthorized stories or books would be punished as a traitor. And so, the council began hunting for the girl who wrote the story that made the villagers laugh, the girl whose words had dared to fly where no one else's voice had reached in years. Lena watched from her window as soldiers marched through the village. Her fingers trembled. Her mother locked the attic trapdoor with shaking hands. The house suddenly felt too loud, too fragile, too full of secrets. And yet, beneath her fear, something else stirred. A spark. The knock came just before dawn, not the kind of hesitant tap from a neighbor asking for herbs, but the hard, rhythmic thud of authority. Lena and her mother froze. The candle they had lit during the early morning hours still flickered beside a half-unrolled scroll, the ink on its corners still drying. In a flash, her mother snatched the scroll, shoved it under the loose floorboard, and whispered, "Don't say a word." The door burst open before they could fully compose themselves. 3 men entered, their robes bearing the insignia of the council, iron circles stitched in black, as cold and merciless as their eyes. Without a word, they began tearing through the house. They flung open cupboards, pulled up rugs, and knocked over clay pots. When one of them approached the fireplace and began tapping the bricks, Lena's heart pounded in her throat. Another soldier noticed the faint outline of the attic trapdoor. Her mother blocked his way for a moment, but he shoved past her. A long silence followed as dust rained down from above. Then came the heavy sound of boots descending the ladder, and in the man's arms, a stack of books, scrolls, and handwritten scraps. The lead officer let out a breathy laugh. "Well, what do we have here?" The books, yellowed with age, looked like fragile things. But to the council, they were poison. Within an hour, a crowd had gathered in the square. It was rare to see the fire pit lit so early, but today the flames licked high, fed by dry wood and outrage. Lena stood shackled beside her mother, both bound in coarse rope. The elders took their place atop the stone platform, speaking of betrayal, corruption, and the infection of dangerous ideas. "These stories twist truth," one of them said. "They threaten peace. They weaken the soul of our village." Lena tried not to cry as the books were thrown into the fire. Some were old fairy tales, others poetry, histories, or philosophy. Each one ignited with a hiss, a burst of flame, and a shiver that ran down her spine. Her mother kept her gaze fixed on the sky, her face unreadable. But Lena could feel it, the heartbreak humming just beneath her skin. Then came the verdict. Her mother, accused of treason, was to be exiled beyond the borders, left in the wild lands, where few returned. Lena begged, shouted that it was her fault, that she had written the stories, not her mother. But the council had already decided. "The girl is young," one elder said. "She can be corrected." But the mother poisoned her mind. As the guards dragged her mother away, she turned once, eyes locking with Lena's. "Live," she whispered. "But never forget." Lena was left standing in the ashes. She was no longer a citizen, not in the full sense. The council declared her a watcher, a half-person, bound by rules that restricted her voice, her movement, and her thoughts. She could not speak publicly. She could not teach, write, or leave the village without permission. A mark was stitched into the collar of her dress, a black eye, always open. The people were told to watch her in turn, to report anything unusual. Children were warned not to speak to her. Merchants hesitated to sell her goods. Even old friends began to cross the street to avoid her. The house felt emptier than ever. Her mother's warmth was gone, and the attic, once a treasure chest of wonder, had been stripped bare. She would stare at the soot stains on the floorboards and imagine the books there, still whispering their stories through the ashes. For days, Lena didn't speak. Not even to herself. But grief, like fire, does not always fade. Sometimes it shifts, becoming something sharper. One night, unable to sleep, she found herself reaching for a piece of cloth left behind under the bed. It was stained, torn, and not worth saving, except to her. She tore a twig from a broom, burned the tip in a candle, and used the ash to write her first line in days. They burned the books, but not the words in my mind. And then she kept going. She wrote on the insides of baskets, behind cupboard doors, beneath floor tiles. She scratched verses into the wooden legs of furniture, behind loose stones in garden walls. It was not the same as paper, but it was something. It was survival. Her new stories were not like the old ones. Gone were the soft metaphors and veiled hope. These were darker tales, full of anger, injustice, and warnings. She wrote of villagers who were fed lies until they forgot how to dream. She told of girls punished for questions and mothers torn from their children. She invented a creature that lived under the council hall, a monster with 1,000 mouths that swallowed every word it didn't like. Sometimes, she found strange satisfaction in the secrecy. Each word was a blade, each sentence a seed. She imagined the council's fear if they knew what she was creating right under their watchful eyes. And though she could no longer speak aloud in public, she found other ways to let her stories out. One night, someone found a phrase carved into the base of a tree in the square, "Even ashes remember fire." No one claimed it, but whispers stirred. A week later, another story appeared, scratched into the underside of the well's bucket. It told of a people who had forgotten their names and found them again through a forbidden book. More and more appeared, in toolsheds, under tables at the inn, behind shutters. No one knew who was writing them, but the villagers began to read. And remember. Lena kept her secret well. She said little, kept her head down. But inside, she was alive in a way she hadn't been before. Her mother's exile had broken her, yes, but it had also remade her into something the council could not see coming. A girl with stories in her bones. It started with a knock, soft, rhythmic, and strange. Lena had come to dread knocks, ever since the council's raid. But this one was different. It wasn't the sharp command of authority. It was more like a code. Tap. Tap. Pause. Tap tap. Her breath caught in her throat. She waited. Another knock followed, this time more urgent, but still measured. Against her better judgment, she opened the door. A boy stood there, maybe 16, with mud on his boots and a strange calm in his eyes. He didn't speak. He simply handed her a torn piece of paper with something scrawled on it. A quote, her quote, "Even ashes remember fire." Her words. Words she had etched weeks ago behind the baker's fence. Words no one was supposed to trace back to her. He said only one word, follow. Lena didn't ask how he knew. Something about his presence assured her that whatever he represented was different from the dangers she had known. They moved through the narrow alleys of the village, across a dried-up irrigation channel, and past an abandoned root cellar. He led her to a crumbled hut that looked long dead. Inside, under a loose slab of stone, was a tunnel. She hesitated for only a moment before climbing down. It was cold, damp, and lit only by the faintest glow of lanterns in the distance. The air was thick with earth and secrets. As they walked, the tunnel opened into a cavern of sorts, small, rounded, and lined with sacks, crates, and people. There were maybe 10 of them, young and old, sitting in quiet circles. On the far wall was something breathtaking, stories. Lines carved, painted, and etched into the rock. Verses, poems, entire pages copied by hand onto cloth and plastered along the walls. Some were hers, her very words. Others were from books she'd never seen, tales long buried but not forgotten. "Welcome to the Echo Circle," said a woman with silver-streaked hair and fierce eyes. "We keep the truth alive." The Echo Circle, Lena soon learned, was older than she expected, formed generations ago when the council first began rewriting history. They were healers, farmers, weavers, and masons by day, but by night, they became archivists of memory. They had tales and quilts, braided fables into hair, wove secrets into fishing nets and songs. And now, they had her. Lena shared some of her newer writings, quietly, unsure how they would be received. But the moment she read them aloud in the flickering light, something shifted. The room leaned in. Her stories, full of sorrow and outrage, felt like mirrors. One woman wept when Lena told the tale of the stolen children, masked as an allegory about birds that forgot how to fly. A man clenched his fists when she spoke of dissidents who were erased from family records and replaced with council-friendly names. These weren't just stories. They were memories people had buried because it was too dangerous to remember. They called her Ash Hand, a name born from how she used scorched ash to write her earliest messages. It became her mask, her shield, and her rallying cry. The Echo Circle began copying her work. Carefully, they scribed her stories onto strips of cloth, bark, and clay. They left them in the marketplace, wrapped around bread loaves, hidden in produce baskets, tucked under benches in the prayer hall. They taught children to recite coded lines as rhymes. A fable could travel farther than a name, and hers traveled like wildfire. One story in particular caught fire, The Village Without a Sky, in which the elders built a false sky to hide the stars and told everyone it had always been so. It was an obvious allegory, and yet, it spoke to something deeper. People began to question things they had taken as truth. If stars were real once, what else had been erased? Then came The Silent River, a tale that described a once bustling part of the village, now dry and abandoned, where people used to gather before they were taken. Names were never used in her stories, but those who had lived long enough knew the references. Some had lost brothers and sisters to those years, and now, the silence around those disappearances was cracking. Whispers grew louder. Villagers no longer trusted the council's version of history as blindly as before. Murmurs spread in taverns, in hushed tones over dinner, in the way people looked at the council during sermons. And the council noticed. They first heard of Ash Hand as a rumor, a ghostwriter, some said, a returned spirit seeking revenge, others whispered. The name unsettled them. It gave shape to something they could not see or control. Soon, the council began cracking down again. Surprise searches increased. Public floggings returned. The well in the square was guarded after someone found a carved line that read, "Truth is water, and lies are stone." Water wins, always. But the Echo Circle adapted. They moved quicker, shared shorter stories, taught villagers to memorize and pass tales orally. Lena became careful, cautious, but never stopped. Her mind now held stories like maps, each one a route to a hidden truth. She started to feel something strange, hope. Not the fragile, childish kind she once clung to, but something deeper. Her stories were no longer just a coping mechanism. They were fuel for resistance. Her words, once scrawled in isolation, now traveled farther than she ever could. And yet, danger crept closer. One morning, she passed the village square and noticed something chilling. A wall had been painted with an enormous eye, and beneath it were the words, "Ash Hand will be found." And silenced. She felt fear. But also resolve. They could not unburn what was already in motion. Her stories lived in minds now, not just paper or walls. They had already planted themselves in the bones of the people. And stories, once rooted, are harder to kill than even the strongest laws. It began with a simple line, "The swine kings snorted truth into mud, then danced upon it like victory." Lena had written it in the still of night, her fingers shaking with the weight of it. The song of the swine kings wasn't like her other stories. It was sharper, meaner, more alive with venom. Each character in the tale bore a striking resemblance to one of the 7 council members, too close, really. The first swine, a glutton who hoarded grain during a famine, clearly mirrored Elder Gorin. The second, who spoke with honeyed words and whipped dissenters with smiles, resembled Elder Mita. On and on, the swine kings ruled with absurd rituals, silencing any who dared to sing their own songs. In the tale's climax, the people rose, not in violence, but with laughter, mocking the kings so thoroughly that their power crumbled under the weight of truth. It was dangerous. Lena knew this. Yet it felt necessary. She recited it aloud to the echo circle, and for a moment, silence followed. Not stunned silence, but reverent, the kind that filled a room when everyone felt something sacred had just happened. Then they copied it, word for word. The story spread faster than anything Lena had written. Children hummed its refrain in back alleys. Farmers scratched its verses into their tools. Lovers whispered it like prayer. Soon, lines were everywhere. And still the swine kings sang, believing themselves choirs of light, when all heard only squeals. People couldn't get enough of it. The satire gave them power. It made them feel clever. It made them feel seen. But it also made them targets. It wasn't long before the council responded. One morning, the village square filled with whispers. Elder Bako, the gentle, gray-haired man who had quietly tended the herb garden for decades, was dragged onto the execution platform. The council claimed he'd been caught reciting treason. No trial. No defense. Just a scroll unfurled with his alleged crime, spreading the song of the swine kings. When the blade fell, something broke. It wasn't just the death of an elder, it was the public shattering of the unspoken agreement the council had long maintained. They would punish, yes, but rarely with such public cruelty. Bako had been loved, respected, trusted even by those loyal to the council. His death sent ripples through the village. Whispers turned into outrage. Lena heard of it while hiding in the cellar beneath the weaver's shop. She wept. Bako had once brought her honey fruit when she was a child. She remembered his kindness, his silent nods when she passed. The idea that her story had contributed to his death felt like a wound too deep to clean. She didn't write for days. But silence didn't quiet the storm. The people had already tasted something electric, truth with teeth. And truth, once heard, echoes. Still, guilt haunted her. Could her stories cause harm? Could the power of words be too sharp, too wild to control? Then the betrayal came. The Echo Circle had planned a secret meeting that night, deeper into the tunnels, far past the old root cellar. Lena was late, which saved her life. When she arrived, something felt off. The passage was too quiet. No lanterns flickered. No footsteps echoed. Then, shouting. Boots. A scream. She turned and fled before her shadow gave her away, heart pounding like a war drum. Behind her, she heard the crack of wood, the thud of bodies falling, the shouts of the council's enforcers. She didn't stop running until she collapsed behind a tangle of storage crates near the tannery. She lay there for what felt like hours, cold and gasping, shaking with adrenaline and horror. The next day, she learned the truth: the meeting had been ambushed. Someone had betrayed them. The council had known the exact location, the exact time. Half the circle was captured. Including Dara. Dara, her closest friend, the first to call her ash hand, the one who stitched stories into fishing nets, who always carried honey drops for when Lena's voice grew hoarse from reading aloud, was gone. Reports said she had been seen bound and bleeding, dragged into the council's chamber. Rumors swirled that Dara was being interrogated, tortured for names, locations, anything. Lena wanted to scream. She wanted to burn the entire council hall to the ground. But she did none of that. She stayed hidden. She watched. She listened. She realized something even more dangerous than rage had entered her heart: clarity. They feared her stories. Not because they were pretty or clever, but because they were effective. Her words were seeds. Even when cut down, they grew back, stronger and wilder. She wanted to quit. But she couldn't. Not now. Not after Bako. Not while Dara was in pain because of her. So she did the only thing she knew how to do. She picked up a scrap of cloth, dipped her finger in ink, and wrote. The swine kings howled when the sky turned to mirrors, for they could not bear the sight of themselves. And beneath it, Ash Hand still sings. The betrayal came not with a shout or a blade, but a soft knock in a familiar face. Jero. He'd been one of the first Lena trusted in the Echo Circle, young, eager, always scribbling notes during meetings, always ready to pass along stories. They'd laughed together, shared crusts of bread in the tunnels, even whispered their fears into the darkness. He had a younger sister, barely 5, with lungs too weak to handle the mountain air. "I'd do this for her," he'd always said. But now he stood at the door of her hideout, nervous, eyes darting like he knew he'd see monsters behind every shadow. "I had to," he whispered, trembling. "They took her. My sister. They said they'd let her die unless I gave them something." Lena didn't run. She didn't even scream. She just looked at him and asked, very quietly, "Did you give them my name?" He nodded. The moment shattered like glass. Moments later, the council's enforcers crashed through the door. They dragged her through the village in chains. Some villagers looked away in shame. Others watched in stunned silence. A few spat at her feet. Traitor. Witch. Liar. Ash Hand. Her name had twisted into myth and menace, feared by those too frightened to listen, cherished only in hushed corners. The council's underground prison was colder than Lena imagined. It reeked of rot and mold. They threw her into a cell barely large enough to stretch her legs. She spent the first night in silence, biting her own tongue to stay awake. Dreams could betray her. On the third day, a rat led her to salvation. It scurried through a crack in the wall behind her straw bed. Curious, and desperate for anything other than the echo of her breath, Lena shifted the bed aside and felt along the wall. Her fingers found a loose stone. She pried it free. Behind it, a hidden tunnel, narrow and damp. She crawled. The air changed. It grew warmer, mustier, thick with dust and something older, secrets. The tunnel opened into a chamber lit by a single shaft of filtered light. And there, laid out on crumbling wooden shelves and rotting tables, were scrolls, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. They were brittle, ink-faded, many half-burned. But they were real. Forgotten pieces of history the council had hidden, hoarded, maybe even rewritten. She read feverishly. There were truths here, ugly, raw truths. One scroll described the massacre of dissenters 70 years ago, rewritten by the council as the year of the Great Fire, blamed on lightning. Another told of a woman who had gathered songs and stories from all across the land, only to be executed for distorting the order's purity. That woman's last name had been Wayna, the same as Lena's grandmother. Lena didn't have paper. So she used her mind. She memorized names, dates, phrases. She recited them in rhythm to herself. Words became drums. Truth became armor. The next morning, they came for her. Her trial was held not in the council hall but in the public square, where everyone could see the face of rebellion. The elders stood robed in crimson, grim as carved stone. Elder Goran read the charges: treason, blasphemy, defamation, incitement. Elder Mita smiled when she read the sentence. "Death by flame," she said sweetly. Poetic justice for a girl who loved to burn truth into words. Lena was bound to the stake that afternoon. The villagers filled the square in silence, the way one might gather at the edge of a cliff. Many expected to feel triumphant. Instead, they felt hollow. As the torch neared the base of the pyre, Lena raised her head. She said nothing. She didn't scream. She simply stared into the crowd as if memorizing every face. Then, a shout. It came from the rooftop above the butcher's stall. A flash of silver. Smoke bombs exploded in the square. Chaos. A figure dropped from the roof, masked and cloaked, moving like a shadow set on fire. The guards fell before they could draw blades. In one smooth motion, the figure slashed Lena's bonds and pulled her from the flames just as the fire caught the bottom twigs. They ran through smoke and screams, down alleys, across rooftops, until they slipped into an abandoned root cellar behind the old schoolhouse. Only then did the figure remove the mask. Lena's breath caught. Her mother. Older, her face marked with lines from years in exile, but her eyes just as fierce as ever. The same eyes Lena had looked into as a child when learning to shape letters with her fingers. "You didn't think I'd let them take you that easily, did you?" her mother said with a tired smile. Lena couldn't speak. She collapsed into her mother's arms, sobbing. They held each other, two exiles in a world built on lies. But now they had something more than grief between them. They had truth. And they had fire. The ruins lay just beyond the forest ridge, hidden beneath the skeletal remains of an old monastery the council had once burned down, long before Lena was born. Moss-covered stone arches jutted from the earth like broken teeth, and the ground was soft with centuries of ash and forgotten prayers. Here, beneath a shattered sky, the exiles had built something new, a place stitched together from salvaged wood, cloth, and hope. Lena and her mother arrived under cover of night. A sentry led them past a maze of trenches and traps, deeper into the heart of the hidden camp. Tents flapped in the cold wind, and fires burned low, guarded by those who had survived the council's punishments, former guards, teachers, storytellers, farmers whose only crime had been remembering too much. In this ragged place, truth thrived in whispers. Lena was given a small shelter built into the curve of a collapsed archway. The next morning, her mother returned with others, old, sharp-eyed scholars with ink-stained hands and trembling voices, rebels whose tongues still bore the scars of iron, a boy who had seen his father taken in the night and never returned. Each one had a story. And each story carried weight. So, Lena began to write. At first, her hands shook too much. Her mind kept replaying the fire licking at her feet, the feeling of rope cutting her wrists, the crowd's silence as they watched her burn. But then she thought of Jero. Of the little girl he gave her up for. She thought of the masked elder the council had executed. Of her friend whose screams still haunted the tunnels of her dreams. Of the library that once filled her attic, now reduced to ash and smoke. She dipped her quill in ink, and the words came like a flood. The true history of our village. Each page was a blade. She recorded names: Elder Goran, who orchestrated the poisonings of dissenters during the winter famine. Elder Mita, who signed the orders for the children stolen and re-educated. Lena included dates, original documents smuggled from council archives by defectors. There were testimonies, dozens, signed by exiled teachers, former guards, even a midwife who had seen infants declared unfit and taken into the night. The story became more than just a manuscript. It became evidence. A trial in ink. The camp gathered around her every evening as she read pages aloud. Grown men wept. Women clenched their fists. And children, those born in exile, listened with the awe of those hearing their past return to them like stolen breath. But inside the village, something strange began to stir. The guards had heard of Lena's execution. And then they'd heard that she had vanished. That the fire had failed. Some said the flame itself refused to burn her. And then, rumors. A hidden camp in the ruins. A manuscript filled with truth. Names. Confessions. That she was alive, and writing. One guard, young and untested, slipped a note under the door of the baker's shop. Another left a candle burning in a window when it wasn't night. Silent signals, old rebel codes from the first resistance 30 years ago. Some guards, those whose parents had vanished, or whose loved ones bore the scars of council cruelty, began sneaking food out at night, hiding it beneath stones along the riverbank. Others passed along whispered reports. The council was on edge, interrogating their own, burning even their private records, fearing leaks from within. Elder Goran stopped appearing in public. Elder Mita had guards sleep outside her door. Elder Ron was said to have woken screaming from nightmares of fire and blood. Even the enforcers grew tense, aware they might be on the wrong side of a gathering storm. And in the ruins, Lena kept writing. Her manuscript now filled 3 thick leather-bound volumes. Each one meticulously organized, referenced, footnoted. This wasn't just rebellion. It was scholarship. It was journalism. It was the first real history the village had seen in a century. But truth alone would not be enough. Lena knew that. The people had to believe it. So she wrote one more thing. At night, while others slept, Lena penned a final chapter. A story, not a report, not a record, but a parable. A tale of a village in the hills ruled by silent tyrants. Of a girl whose voice could set fire to lies. It was part myth, part memory. It didn't name the council, but everyone would know. This story she copied 100 times. Rebels memorized it, sang parts of it as songs. A child painted a version onto cloth and flew it as a flag above the ruins. The guards inside the village were no longer loyal, they were afraid. Some hoped Lena would win. Others feared she already had. The council began rationing firewood, afraid of coded signals being passed between chimneys. The town crier's bell was removed, no one trusted announcements anymore. In the market stalls? Quiet. People were whispering again. Sharing glances. Remembering. The truth was out there. And it was coming home. The night before the harvest festival was one of silence and storm. In the ruins, the exiles moved like shadows, working by lanternlight and breath held tight in their chests. The printing press, a rattling, salvaged monstrosity hidden beneath the stone floor of the old chapel, churned page after page. The ink, thick and dark, bled into the fibers like veins, each word a heartbeat. Each copy of the true history of our village was wrapped in cloth and stacked in crates lined with straw. Lena stood over them, hands stained with ink and resolve. Her mother clasped her shoulder once, briefly, and disappeared into the shifting dark. At dawn, they moved. Rebels, disguised as festival workers, entered the village in waves, carrying baskets that seemed to hold fruits, barrels that looked like mead, cloth bundles passed off as decorations. No one questioned them. The harvest festival was the one day of unity, when every villager, from the cobbler to the cook to the guards themselves, gathered beneath the autumn sun to give thanks to the land, and to the council. But not this year. By mid-morning, the village square was alive with music and scent. Children darted between stalls. The council watched from their high tower with cold smiles, proud of the illusion they had maintained so long. They didn't see the ropes climbing their tower's sides. Lena moved with purpose through the crowd, her cloak drawn tight, her heart thundering. The bells began to chime the festival hour. And then, the chimes stopped. A scream echoed from the tower, not of terror, but of shock. All eyes turned upward. A flag dropped from the central spire, black cloth with white script. The first words of the manuscript painted in massive strokes. "We were lied to." Gasps rippled through the crowd. And then a voice, clear, calm, steady, rose from above. Amplified by the tower's ancient horn system, Lena's voice filled every corner of the village. "My name is Lena. You were told I died. You were told I was a threat to peace. But I lived. And I write. And now, you will hear the truth." A second flag unfurled, this one bearing the names of every exile, every executed rebel, every child taken. Hundreds of names. Too many to ignore. Rebels threw open the tower windows and began dropping the books, copies of the true history, into the square below. The villagers caught them in outstretched arms. Pages scattered through the air like a blizzard of forgotten voices. And Lena began to read. She read of the purge of the winter famine. Of the order of silence and the poison in the well. Of the orphan camps built under false names. She read signed confessions, testimonies of guards who had turned, words from mothers whose children never returned. Faces in the crowd turned pale. Some wept openly. Others clutched the books, scanning lines in disbelief. A man tore off his council insignia. A baker sat down in the dirt and rocked, muttering the name of her brother lost 10 years before. Lena's voice never wavered. Then came the moment no one expected. A former enforcer, masked and trembling, stepped forward from the crowd. He lifted his voice and spoke of the night he carried 3 bound villagers to the council chambers and left them there. He had never seen them again. Another guard joined him, then a teacher, a farmhand, a council scribe. Confessions tumbled like water from a burst dam. The crowd surged. From the base of the tower, the council's own guard captain raised a rifle, but another guard struck it down. The line of loyalty had shattered. Within moments, chaos broke loose, but it was not wild. It was righteous. The crowd stormed the council hall. The elders, rattled and cornered, attempted to flee through hidden passages, but the rebels knew those tunnels. They had once lived in them. By midday, the entire council had been captured, those who hadn't already gone into hiding. The square became a courtroom. Not one ruled by fear, but by fire-forged truth. And then, Lena appeared, walking down from the tower like a figure out of her own story, her ink-stained hands visible to all, her eyes clear. The villagers parted for her. She faced the elders, still cloaked in their fine robes, but now bent and broken beneath the weight of exposed lies. "You burned our past," she said, voice hoarse but unshaken. "You tried to silence our tongues. But words grow roots." The villagers cheered, wild, raw. Lena raised her hand for silence. She turned to the elders. "You have 2 paths," she said. "Exile, into the wilderness with no power, no title. Or you may face a trial, fair and open, by the people you governed." The elders were speechless. Elder Mita collapsed in a faint. Elder Goran snarled but said nothing. Elder Run whispered for mercy, but none was given, not yet. A vote was taken, right there in the square. The people chose trial. No executions. No torches. Just the slow, painful reckoning of truth finally told. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, Lena walked to the remains of the great fire pit where books had once burned, and she dropped the last copy of the true history into the flame. Not to destroy it, but to baptize it. From ashes, after all, stories rise. Months passed, and with each day, the village began to transform. The once quiet streets now thrummed with the pulse of change, voices raised in conversation, laughter ringing through the air, the constant hum of work and rebellion intertwining like the roots of new trees growing deep in the soil. At the heart of this revolution stood the first free library, a beacon of knowledge and resilience. What had once been the council's grand hall, now stripped of its power and its lies, had been repurposed. The grand wooden doors, once sealed tight to keep the truth hidden, were now flung open, welcoming all who sought the light of wisdom. Lena stood in the center of the library, her hands on the polished wooden table that had been salvaged from the old merchant stall. Shelves filled with books lined the walls, some written by rebels, some by scholars who had defied the council's oppression, and others that had been passed down through generations, whispering secrets of long-forgotten eras. The walls were adorned with new maps of the village and its surrounding lands, drawn by the hands of villagers who had never been allowed to dream beyond the borders of their own oppression. All around her, people, old and young, perused, debated, and learned. Lena's heart swelled as she watched the transformation unfold. She had been the one to write the history, but now, it was the villagers who were writing their own futures. They had taken what the council had tried to destroy and turned it into something beautiful, something lasting. In the far corner of the room, a young girl sat with a book held tightly in her hands, her eyes wide with wonder. Lena approached her quietly and knelt beside her. The child looked up at her, not with fear, but with curiosity. "Do you like the story?" Lena asked gently. The girl nodded eagerly. "It's about the village before the burning, right?" Lena smiled softly, brushing a strand of hair from the child's face. "Yes. And now it's your story, too." In the years to come, Lena would teach children like her how to read and write. She would guide them through the pages of books that once had been forbidden, teaching them not just the words, but the power they held. She would teach them to think for themselves, to question what they were told, to seek the truth even when it seemed hidden behind walls of fear. But it wasn't just the children who had to learn. The adults who had spent so long in the shadows of ignorance, those who had been loyal to the council out of fear, out of habit, or out of simple compliance, needed to learn again. They sat in the library with furrowed brows, struggling with the words they had never been allowed to read. But they came, day after day, with determination and curiosity in their hearts. They wanted to know, to understand, to reclaim what had been stolen from them. The library wasn't just a place for books, it was a place for healing, for growing, for reconciling with the past. It was a testament to everything the village had lost, and everything it had reclaimed. Lena's mother had seen it all. She had seen the day when the village erupted in truth, when the council fell and the people rose. She had lived to see the library filled with the stories that once were smothered, to hear the laughter of children learning to read freely, and to feel the weight of justice restored. And yet, Lena's mother was frail now, her once sharp eyes dimmed by time. She had known the cost of rebellion, the sacrifices, the struggles, and the pain. But she had never regretted her choice to protect her daughter, to ensure that Lena could live in a world where her voice could be heard. One evening, after a long day of teaching and organizing the library's growing collection, Lena sat beside her mother's bedside, holding her hand. The old woman smiled weakly, her once lustrous hair now silver and thin. "You've done it," her mother whispered, her voice trembling but proud. "You've made it." Lena squeezed her mother's hand, tears threatening to fall. "I couldn't have done it without you." Her mother's eyes fluttered closed for a moment, as if she were drifting into a dream, and when they opened again, they shone with an almost ethereal peace. "You've given them a future, Lena. And that is worth everything." The next morning, Lena found her mother peacefully gone, a smile still playing on her lips. It was as if she had been waiting for this moment, for the work to be done, for the village to be reborn, before she could let go. There were no words to express the grief in Lena's heart, no way to explain how empty the world felt without her mother's steady presence beside her. But there was also a profound sense of gratitude. Her mother had lived to see the world change, and that was a gift. Lena stood before the village's gathered people that day, in the quiet before the funeral. She addressed them not as a historian, but as the child of a woman who had fought for her and for all of them. "Today, we mourn," Lena said, her voice steady despite the weight in her chest. "But we also honor her. My mother, and all those who gave their lives, their hearts, their stories, to make this village what it is. This library, these books, these words, they are the legacy she left behind." And so, the library grew. Lena became the village's official historian, chosen not by the council or by anyone with power, but by the people who had fought beside her, who had believed in the power of words. Her role was not just to record the past, but to help shape the future, to guide those who came after her through the winding paths of history. As the years went by, Lena continued to write. Her hand never stopped moving, and the stories kept flowing, each one more powerful than the last. She wrote not just for the village, but for the world beyond, stories of truth, of justice, of the fires that burned and the ashes that remained. And then one day, years later, Lena stood in the library with the same young girl who had once sat reading her first book. This time, the girl was a young woman, poised to take on the world. Lena placed a glass case before the child, now an adult, inside which were scraps of cloth, pages once scribbled with stories written in secret, rags that had once held Lena's first, forbidden words. "Do you remember?" Lena whispered. "They burned my books." The young woman smiled, her eyes bright with understanding. "But they couldn't stop the story." Lena nodded, her heart full. "No. They couldn't." And as the fire flickered in the hearth behind them, Lena knew that her story would never end, because stories, once born, could never be extinguished.